African leaders are working to create what some people are calling a borderless Africa by introducing a single African passport, allowing free movement between all countries on the continent. The African Union, which represents 54 states, wants to abolish the need for Africans to get visas to visit African countries by 2018. And by next year, the AU wants to establish a free trade area across the continent. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Angelo Coppola, who joins us from Johannesburg. And Angelo, let's start with the AU passport and the concept of a borderless Africa. What's been the reaction in South Africa? And that's a country where, people haven't thrown out the welcome mat to foreigners trying to get into the country. There have been a spate of xenophobic attacks in the past few years.
Well, the reaction has been fairly muted. While President Zuma was at the latest AU summit, there hasn't been any official word yet on the South African position. It's also been fairly quiet from the Minister of Home Affairs, that's Malusi Gigaba. His department, you remember, was responsible for the new visa requirements into South Africa that had such a devastating impact on tourist numbers into the country last year. Those regulations, of course, have since been loosened or relaxed a bit, but there's still some after effects there. The South African authorities wanted metric validation, in-person application for anyone wanting to come to South Africa to get those visas, something that the AU is also requesting with their new passports. There are analysts, though, who question the need for a continental passport when all that would really be required to make travel for Africans in Africa visa-free was to visas altogether, and they could then use their validated passports that they're currently holding. Anna?
So now, how would a passport like this work? Would it be recognized by the rest of the world, for example?
Well, we're a bit thin on the detail at the moment, other than the marketing event that took place a couple of weeks ago at the AU summit, where those ceremonial passports were handed over to several high-level AU leaders. We don't really know that much. There's likely to be some reticence, though. I'm thinking here about South Africa, of course, given the reluctance to open its borders. It's also unlikely that the passports would be recognized by the rest of the world anytime soon. In his statement at the end of the summit, the South African president only mentioned these e-passports right near the end of his speech. And even then, he didn't give any clear indication that the South Africans were going to support the initiative. Stone has been put in place, as you said, and this would be the first clue that this process is on track. And that's the publication of that implementation roadmap, which is due to see the light of day in around 2018. Then, of course, it's 2020, and this is the date that's been penciled in as the deadline for all Africans to have a continental passport. That's just 4 years away from today, Anand.
Now, Angela, you mentioned expanding tourism, but what other advantages does an African passport bring to Africa and Africans?
Well, according to the AU here, they're saying that the passport should lead to the free flow of continental citizens that should stimulate economic growth. It should also see the free movement of skilled people, something that countries like South Africa have struggled with in the past for a range of unrelated issues. At the moment, though, there are very few countries on the continent that have relaxed their visa regulations, and there are probably 4 of them. There's Ghana, Seychelles, Rwanda, and Mauritius, and they've seen the benefit of having either relaxed or removed their visas altogether. If it does get the required traction, it's going to be a catalyst to broad-ranging continental economic growth, but it requires in-country acceptance first. So governments and citizens in these 54 countries on the continent have to sign off on the plan. Something that could prove to be a bit of a stumbling block. Anand?
All right, thanks, Angelo. That's CCTV's Angelo Coppola reporting from Johannesburg. Joining us now from Nairobi is Wanyama Masinde. He's the director at the Center for Regional Integration. Also with us from Nairobi is David Stanton. He's the Director General of Trademark East Africa, a trade organization aimed at growing prosperity in East Africa. From Johannesburg, we're joined by Adetunji Omatola. He's the founder of the Guild of Nigerian Professionals in South Africa. And here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Edward Brown. He's the Director of Policy Advisory Services at the Africa Center for Economic Transformation based in Ghana. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Wanyama, let me start with you in Nairobi. Why an African passport and borderless travel? What does that do for Africa and for Africans?
Yes, it's high time that Africans were able to move freely, because this is something that they've done from before colonial times. If you look at the Abuja Treaty of 1991, Article 43 of the Abuja Treaty, it calls for free movement of Africans, but up to date that is not happening. It's happening just in small pockets of the continent, but movement across the continent is impossible. And yet this is a right for Africans, because if you look at Article 12 of the African Charter for Human and People's Rights, it says that every individual on the continent has a right to leave his country and to return. And these rights are not being enjoyed yet, and the African Union is there to bring prosperity for the people of the continent. And if you look at the continent, we have a number of free trade areas where we are allowing people to move their capital, to move their investment, but we are not allowing those people to follow the investments, and it's high time that this happened. And that's why the African Union at the 50th anniversary celebrations in 2013 called for free movement of people on the continent. And if you look at Agenda 2063 of the continent, therein is a call that among the priorities that Agenda 2063 should deliver is free movement of people on the continent. We want people to do business. We want people to bring prosperity. For them to do business, we need to allow them to move.
Okay, let's talk about prosperity. David, as we heard from our reporter at the beginning of the program, one of the reasons behind the idea of a borderless Africa is that it would boost economic growth on the continent. Make that connection for us. How does the movement or the free movement of people boost economic growth?
Well, at the moment, Africa has about 14% of the world's population, but only 3% of the economic growth. So there's an imbalance there, and one of the reasons for that is that it's quite difficult to trade across borders on the continent, and that requires better infrastructure and better trade systems. Now, if the better infrastructure and trade systems were introduced, the percentage of trade that is represented by exports within African countries would increase, and that almost always helps to generate incomes and growth in any economy. So I would agree that it's very important to increase the volume of trade by trading across borders, and of course goods, services and people must be allowed to freely cross borders in order for that growth to take place.
Adetunji, this is an ambitious idea, an ambitious plan proposed by the African Union, but do you think that the continent is ready for a common passport and borderless travel? I mean, we just have to look at South Africa, where you are right now. There's been widespread xenophobic attacks against foreigners in South Africa. There's a perception there that foreigners are taking away local jobs. So are we ready for this?
Well, look, it's, in my view, very ambitious, but in pockets of it, we have to receive it with a lot of excitement. I know, for example, in January this year, there was a maiden flight from Johannesburg to Abuja. South African Airways was actually on that flight. We're very excited. We've been waiting for Nigeria to open up beyond Lagos and Johannesburg. So people in the northern part of Nigeria, they can easily travel into Johannesburg and they can go about their business and go further into South Africa. So I believe it's exciting. But there are many challenges, of course. We know that Africa tends to be compartmentalized in terms of regions. You have SADC, you have COMESA, you have ECOWAS, and you also have the East African Community. And of course, there are language barriers. For example, West Africa, where I come from, Nigeria is surrounded by 4 countries, and none of them speak English. So if you recall a few years ago, when President Jonathan wanted to have a conversation with Nigeria's neighbors, they had to go and see Francois Hollande in Paris. So there are many challenges. Of course, even if you look at the issue of currencies, if you wanted to do business in South Africa and you're coming in from Nigeria, you'll have to change from the naira to the dollar, and then come to Johannesburg and change the dollar to the rand. So there's no direct exchange of currencies even between the major economies. And the same is true when you go to Ghana. You've got to change your money to the Ghanaian cedi. So there's a lot of challenges in terms of language barriers, in terms of currencies, in terms of also the volatility that exist currently in some of the major countries in Africa, given the fact that the commodity prices have tapered off, particularly in Angola and Nigeria and many other oil-producing countries. So even though we're excited about the AU passport, we know that only about 13 countries in Africa have gone biometric in terms of their passports. There's only about 13 countries that do visa on arrival, Ghana being one of them that has joined the club lately. So there are many challenges, and I think it's still going to take a long time to be able to see people moving freely. And of course, the poorer countries tend to rely on the money they generate from visas in the same way that they rely on higher tariffs that they generate from people importing into their countries.
Edward, we look at how economic growth could get a boost with the free movement of people, but let's look at another aspect of that idea, and that is, how do current visa restrictions in Africa hurt the continent economically?
I think the evidence is incontrovertible that the current visa restrictions hurt economic development and transformation in Africa. I give you an example. The rapid increase in irregular migration is by nature the outcome of restrictions that are imposed by countries, because migrants would
When
move,
you say irregular, I mean people crossing borders illegally?
People crossing borders without documentation.
Right.
And in fact, the evidence, if you look at the analysis, on the contrary, if you want to control movement, you have to open your borders, because then you can document those who are coming in. And if you document those who are coming in, you have good internal processes of identifying those that are high risk, then you're better off than people who come in whom you don't even know they are there. And if you want to strengthen, one of the key things that we need to do as we open our borders is also to strengthen the institutions that can ensure proper control of labor movements, that can increase the access of labor where the needs are. There is tremendous mismatch between skills across the regions. Right. We have 15 or 18 countries that are landlocked, whose development is contingent on their relationship with the other countries. And with closed borders, you are stifling economic growth. You can't even begin to establish industries that have the capability to expand and produce competitive products, not only for the international market, but for the regional countries in the region. And one of the things that irregular and undocumented migration does is to depress wages in the countries where they go. Because they're not documented, employers take advantage of them, right, and therefore depress wages. On the contrary, if these are documented, then the labor laws would be much more effective in administering and ensuring that people get jobs.
Okay, Wanyama, there was an article in the online business magazine Quartz Africa which said that, and this is the magazine writing, it said that it's appalling that it's easier for Europeans and Americans to travel in Africa than it is for Africans themselves. Why is it so difficult for Africans to travel within the continent?
That is the predicament that we face, that we find it difficult to allow our own people to travel across the continent, and yet we allow people from elsewhere to do that. And this is exhibited, if you look at, in the figures that we have, if you look at intra-African trade, just above 10%, which is a huge difference from what happens elsewhere. Yes, there's been concern looking at the continent because of poverty levels and the mistrust of one another. And in fact, as we move towards free movement of persons, we need to look at the confidence building amongst ourselves. Because look at the continent, 54 states, 54 borders, 54 barriers to doing business. Something is happening. If you look at the Africa Development Bank's Visa Openness Index 2016, you'll see that 20% of African states allow visa-free access to them. 25% visas on arrival, and the other 55, there's a big challenge there. You, as an African, you cannot go there. The fear that people will come to take our jobs because they are poor like us, because the belief then is that those that are from outside Africa are well off, they have the resources, they will not come to take our jobs, they'll come to invest. But look at the continent, there's a lot of investment, intra-African investment. There are Africans investing across borders now. There are states where the bulk of the investments are from across the borders. Africa is changing. It's changing quite a lot, and we need to change with the continent ourselves.
Okay.
We need to open the borders to one another. And if you look at Rwanda, which has opened up, it does not mean that when you open up, you'll be inundated with people from the neighboring countries or elsewhere. It does not happen. People move for a reason.
Right. David, the idea of an African Union passport, will that unify the continent? I mean, couldn't AU member states simply just lift all visa restrictions?
Well, I think the Africa Union proposal is progressive, and as we've heard from other speakers, it is ambitious and a lot of work needs to be done. But the principle of opening up the economies of the continent is critical. And of course, the free movement of goods and services and people is critical. So those obstacles have to be met and overcome. And in East Africa, in the East Africa community, which is a relatively coherent regional economic grouping of only 6 countries, then a lot of progress has actually been made to harmonise standards for services and to, for example, to make the tourism industry more regional and less country-based, allowing foreign direct investment and companies to operate on a regional rather than a national level, and for qualified people and companies to work across the borders. But I do share the concerns of some of the speakers at the scale and the time, the scale of the challenges and the time it will take. But I do think that there are essential measures, and that a free trading across borders and more open migration is essential to make that leap forward. Having said that, we're aware that there are challenges to regional integration in other parts of the world, not least in Europe. So there has to be counterbalancing measures which restrict unlimited flows of migration, so that the burden on countries is not excessive. And after all, the level of underemployment and unemployment in all African countries is unacceptably high. So there has to be well-balanced and carefully managed migration and carefully managed harmonisation of the conditions of trade, so that markets are opened up, common markets are made bigger for foreign direct investors in a way that will encourage a greater proportion of that investment in the African continent.
Okay, we need to take a break right now. More of our conversation about a borderless Africa right after this. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing efforts by the African Union to end visa requirements for all African citizens and to establish a free trade zone across the continent. Let's get back to our panel. Let's go to Adetunji in Johannesburg. Adetunji, you are from Nigeria. Let's look at how a borderless Africa would help a country like Nigeria. It currently is the biggest economy on the continent, but it is largely dependent on oil for revenue. And of course, it's a country also looking at diversifying its economy. So how does an Africa without borders help Nigeria's economy? How does it help Nigeria achieve that goal?
Look, Nigeria's problems are many, but I think within Nigeria, there's so many conversations we're having at the moment in terms of even movements of people. People will follow the money, as I say, and so you'll find that Lagos, which has got about 21 million people, a lot of people are saying, look, we've got to move to Abuja. And then, of course, with the problems in the northeast that we've had, there's a lot of internally displaced people who have run away from Boko Haram, who are circulating within the country. So Nigeria's problems are very, very challenging. But having said that, Nigeria has always played a role, a key role, in helping the rest of Africa with its problems. So we believe that a borderless Africa, particularly if we look at the big countries in Africa, like South Africa, for example, South Africa and Nigeria, they've been trying to get more, this visa-free thing going. President Zuma and President Buhari in March. They've decided that the Binational Commission has to be moved up from the vice presidential level because they really want to bed down this issue of visas because it restricts the ability of South Africans on the one hand and Nigerians on the other to be able to come in. But as we speak currently, we still have about 2-3 flights a day going into Nigeria from Johannesburg with Air Rwanda and also Kenya Airways and South African Airways now doing Abuja and Lagos. So there's a lot of push and pull. But you will accept that, or you'll agree that South Africans will be more wary because we've got about almost 200 million Nigerians. And so if there was to be a visa-free regime, the South Africans will feel that there will be more Nigerians coming this way.
Right. Another big challenge, Edward, would be for African leaders to sell this idea to their respective constituencies. How difficult will that be? I mean, in many instances, you take South Africa, for instance, they've been tightening up border controls.
Yeah. No, I think the way you sell it is to, I mean, it has to be evidence-based. You have to look at what the downside risks are and what the upside benefits are. And in fact, if, you know, with conversations among leaders, I think many leaders now are aware of the benefits of opening the borders. But there's always something that is not intuitive. In other words, if you control your border, then you feel secure. But the question is that what are the downside risks of even increasing the possibilities of all kinds of violence because people come in illegally? So the benefits have to be further. There's the need for awareness raising. There's the need for even among the government institutions for them to recognize the fact that there is value to be derived from opening the borders. You know, and you know the evidence about the trade increase in trade, and also if you look at many of these countries, there is scale mismatch. You know, one of the things we're trying to do at Asset is to look at talent mobility and how you can increase the movement of talent across borders to areas where the demands are highest. If countries are transforming, industries are emerging, new technologies are evolving, even within the African continent, there's a lot of skills, but these skills are mismatched. Most of the time, business persons, high-skilled labor move to Europe or to the United States because it's easier. They are documented and they can have access to it. They come to the other countries, they're not able to work. You know, if you move from, say, a Francophone country to Ghana, the diplomas are not equivalent. So how do you then get employment in the areas that your skills are needed? These are some of the things that needs to be done. While there is the need and there is the determination to open the borders, you need to drill down further on what it would take to make it effective, to make the countries benefit from the open borders.
Right.
Yeah.
Wanyama, one of the countries that's a big supporter of the idea of an African passport, of the free movement of people, is Kenya. In fact, the president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, is fully supportive of the idea of a borderless continent. Why is Kenyatta so keen on that idea?
Kenya is ready for business, and that has been the spirit of the Uhuru government. President Uhuru has gone out of the country on many occasions to seek investments and promote Kenya as an investment destination that is friendly to all investors, be it African or non-African. So yes, Kenya is ready for business, and the president has been advancing this, and that's why he was in Kigali to symbolically receive the African passport. But what happened in Kigali was just symbolic, because the real work now goes ahead. At the moment, we have a meeting in Nairobi, a meeting of experts, which I just walked out from, that the experts are gathering to draft the protocol on the free movement of people for the continent. And it is expected that next year the partner states, member states of the African Union will be able to look at this draft protocol and raise whatever concerns they have in the journey towards adoption and ratification of that protocol. Yes, many African countries want business. Many African countries have realized that, yes, indeed, Africans too can be investors. And that's why if you look across the continent, the more progressive states, the states with more progressive leadership are the ones opening up faster than the others, and of course we encourage the others to open up as well,
right,
so that their borders are not walls.
So David, here we have some countries that are embracing the idea of an African passport fully, the idea of free movement, but yet there are countries that are very resistant to this idea, countries like Equatorial Guinea, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan, where you require a visa to visit, and they have expressed concerns over migration. So how big a challenge is that going to be to convince these countries to join the rest, to lift visa restrictions?
I think that there are variable responses to the proposal for the common passport, and of course we have to recognise national sovereignty and to move forward with those countries that propose it, and to be prepared to take a longer time in negotiating with those who are less enthusiastic. Speaking of East Africa, where trademark works, then the countries of the EAC and in particular the countries of the Northern Corridor, the trade corridor from Mombasa in Kenya through to DRC, is a very, very important artery for trade in the region for several countries, both the seaboard ones, Kenya, and the landlocked ones, Uganda and South Sudan and Rwanda and DRC. And I think that all those countries do recognise the total interdependence in terms of trade in order to generate growth and jobs. So my sense is that if negotiations can be taken forward and physical obstacles to trade are removed at the borders and the ports, the trade systems in terms of electronic cargo tracking and single windows and other electronic means of simplifying trade, and then also the movement of people is facilitated, the countries I'm talking about will all recognise the benefits in terms of the economy and growth and jobs. And fundamentally, whichever country we're talking about in Africa, there is a massive need for further investment, growth and job creation. We've seen in this region as well as in others the dangers of recruitment of underemployed and unoccupied but well-educated people into terrorist organisations. Al-Shabaab is active in this region, and I think it's become an economic imperative to take forward growth and to regionalise growth and to make those links between neighbouring countries, especially on the road corridors, so that this strong growth in the region can be sustained, and it makes a real difference to people who without jobs and who have aspirations like all of us.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.